Over the past 6 years, I've addressed many audiences in Australia about what is now a reality, which is Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme. But this is the first time that I've had the opportunity and the pleasure to to speak to an international audience about a subject that is very dear to my heart, which is disability reform in this country. As Peter indicated, it is a very timely occasion for me to be talking to you, given that Disability Care Australia, which is the organisation that will run the National Disability Insurance Scheme, opened its doors on Monday in 4 launch sites located around the country. There are a number of aspects of the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme which I think are going to be of some interest to you. The first is the sheer scale of the change that is contemplated in the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Currently, disability spending in Australia by governments totals about $7 billion. As a result of the introduction of the NDIS, disability spending in Australia will more than double to about $16 billion over the next 6 years. It will take disability spending from about 0.5% of GDP to 1% of GDP, and if you express it as a proportion of government spending, from about 2% of government outlays to 4% of government outlays. And those of you who are familiar with public policy would understand the sheer size of that change and also the speed with which it's being introduced. The second aspect that's important is that 5-6 years ago, disability policy was not on the radar of governments in this country. So we've taken disability from the absolute margins of public policy to the mainstream. And the impetus for that change has come from the private sector, from people outside government. So 5 years ago, disability hardly figured in the budgets of our Commonwealth and state parliaments. It was almost an afterthought. The occasional wheelchair or other piece of essential equipment as an afterthought in years when governments had excess money to spend. And you can contrast that with the last federal budget, which was handed down 2 months ago in May, when in what was overall an austere budget, still affected by the global financial crisis, disability policy and disability reform was the centrepiece. And within that budget, not only did the government commit to the immediate funding of the NDIS, but it laid out a blueprint for its funding for the next 10 years. The third critical aspect is that the NDIS is not just about more money for disability. It totally reframes and reshapes the way disability services are going to be delivered in Australia, taking disability from what was essentially a welfare and a charity model to one based on insurance. And given your interest in health, and in particular in health insurance, there are obviously strong parallels between health insurance and disability insurance. In fact, if you go back to the seminal work undertaken by Kenneth Arrow in the early 1960s, which showed that communities are better off to have universal health insurance rather than relying on private health insurance alone, he had a category which he called failure to recover, which of course were people who entered the health system but then did not achieve full functionality. And so in that sense, the idea that disability insurance should sit side by side with health insurance has been around for 50 years, yet it has not yet been introduced in any other country until it is now being introduced in Australia today. And I say that knowing that there are disability insurance schemes in Europe, but they're more about income protection than about providing people with the essential services they need if they happen to have a severe and profound and permanent disability. And the fourth very significant element in the change that we're seeing in disability in Australia, disability policy in Australia, is that this reform has emerged from the private sector, from people outside government and outside the public service. And we have taken this idea to government, to the Australian people, and have had it adopted and now embraced as a central part of what governments should do. So to date, disability policy has, as I said, been at the margins of public policy, and it's now at the centre. It's now become one of the first things that governments in this country should fund, rather than one of the last, because this is an entitlement scheme based on need. The idea for this reform has come largely from a small group of people. A man called John Walsh, an actuary, who's undertaken most of the analytical work that underpins this scheme, myself and a few others. My interest in disability began about 30 years ago, nearly 30 years ago, when my oldest son Michael was born with cerebral palsy. Before that time, I knew very little about disability because it hadn't touched me. But from that moment onwards, I've been deeply immersed in disability organisations and in latter years in disability policy. So when Mike was about 3, I first joined the board of a disability service organisation, and for most of the last 30 years I've been on boards of different disability organisations. In that role, my interest has essentially been, for most of that period, was in two things: the financial viability of the organisations of which I was a director, and the quality of the services we provided. But about 7 years ago, I visited one of the early intervention centres, one of the kindergartens that the organisation I was then chairman of, Uralla, which is Victoria's largest disability service provider, was running. And I sat down and I talked with the mother of a child with a disability. It was clear she was born in another country, she was an immigrant in Australia. And she asked me a very simple but very deep question, and it was, why can't my child get the early intervention services that he needs? I then went into a very long explanation about why how at Uralla we were doing the best we could. The staff were working overtime. But I came away from that encounter appalled by my answer, because I was in effect defending the status quo. And really from that moment onwards, I've been on a path to try and see disability policy reformed in this country. I was fortunate that at the time I was serving on the board of another organisation, and the chairman of that board was a former Prime Minister of Australia, Brian Howe. I went and saw Brian and I asked him, well, what can I do about disability policy? How can we change the way services are provided, and how can we meet the great unmet need and undermet need? And he said to me that, Bruce, you need to start thinking about disability differently. No longer think about it as a welfare issue, but think about it as an insurance issue and a risk issue and an investment issue. And having had a long time working in the insurance industry, it was a light bulb moment, because it's obvious that this is about insurance. We are all at risk of a disability. In fact, for most of us, it's just a question of when that disability is going to happen. A young man with a disability once said to me a few years ago, there are only 2 types of people in the world, Bruce: those with disabilities and those who are going to get one soon. And he was right. And so there was this sort of moment where Brian said to me, look, it's a risk issue and it's an insurance issue, and it is, because we're all at risk. The impact of disability, if it's severe, is profound. You cannot insure for it through the private sector, and so the best way to think about disability insurance is as universal insurance, just like with health insurance. Soon after talking to Brian, I met John Walsh, this actuary who's done most of the work underpinning the scheme. John himself is a quadriplegic. He acquired a disability when he was about 18 years of age, playing rugby. And ever since that time, and his qualification as an actuary, he's been interested in health policy and disability policy. And when I met John in about 2006, he'd already done some work to show that you could establish an insurance scheme for people with catastrophic injury. And we talked about the opportunity to create an insurance scheme for all people with severe and profound disabilities in Australia. And it was really, in John's words, quite simple. All we had to do was collect the data, analyse it, and then make the case to argue that an insurance approach would be a much more efficient way of dealing with disability than the current welfare approach. And that's what he and I have essentially done with many, many others over the last 6 or 7 years. In order to understand how this reform came about, I think it's important to understand a couple of background pieces of information. The first is, I think it's important to set some context in terms of Australia's political system and how our governments are organised. And second, to give you some sense of how disability policy has changed over the last 30 or 40 years following the event of the disability rights movement in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In terms of government in Australia, we are, at one sense, a large country, and clearly, physically, Australia is large, but we are, in a sense, a very small country, a country of 22 million people, and it's a country where our representatives in the Parliament are accessible. And so it is possible in Australia to run a bottom-up movement, create a groundswell of movement and influence our political leaders and get them to change public policy. As an example of this, I've already indicated that I knew, as a result of one of my board positions, a former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. In my local electorate, the local member, when he heard I was working on this scheme, on this idea, at one of the special schools, one of the schools that provide services, education services to children with disability, he came and saw me. I didn't have to go and see him. And so it is possible in Australia to influence our political leaders through a mass movement. We always knew that critical to this reform would be the creation of a mass movement. It's a movement that we created with very little money. The funding for the campaign that underpinned and promoted the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which we call Every Australian Counts, cost less than $4 million. And that funding was contributed by non-government organisations working in the disability sector who wanted to see this large-scale reform. The second critical aspect, I think, which affected the way this campaign ran, is that Australia is a federation of Commonwealth and states. There are 6 states, 2 territories, and then a Commonwealth government. And we needed to influence both the Commonwealth government and those state and territory governments. And the reason for that is that most revenues are raised at the Commonwealth level, but responsibility for delivering disability services to date has been a state responsibility. And so we needed to bring both Commonwealth and state governments together to ensure this reform would take place. When I think about other countries with a federated system, I think we were very fortunate that there were just 9 governments that we needed to influence rather than many, many more. And many people have said to me that we could never, for example, have undertaken a reform like this in the US, you know, with both its central government and its 51 states. The third critical element was that when you look at the positioning of government and the positioning of government within Australian society and the Australian economy, governments in Australia sit somewhere between the US model of minimum intervention and the European models of high intervention. So government spending in Australia is about 24% of GDP, so sitting between those US and European poles. And so it was not out of the question to argue that disability policy should have, disability spending should have a more prominent position within the overall envelope of government spending in Australia. And the final critical element to this reform was that we framed this as an economic argument. The dominant paradigm and the dominant frame within which policy is analysed and developed in Australia is essentially an economic framework. And so we moved the debate about disability policy in Australia from essentially one about rights and about social policy to make the economic case for this reform. And as I'll explain later, we were able to show that the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the economic benefits of that far outweighed the costs. And so we were able to run the gauntlet of public policy debate and reform and able to show that disability policy needed to become more prominent within government spending overall. The reason why disability policy had not become more prominent is because up until the idea of a National Disability Insurance Scheme became prominent, the arguments were essentially about disability rights and about social policy. And so it's worth spending a moment to go back and look at the history of disability rights in Australia. Australia participated in the disability rights movement along with many other countries in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And essentially that period led to 2 major changes. The first was the closure of most institutions in which people with disability up to that time had largely been incarcerated. But it didn't lead to the closure of all of those institutions. Those people who moved out of those institutions moved into the community. But in moving into the community, they did not, in most cases, participate in that community. They sat side by side with that community rather than being fully included. And in the words of a report that was issued in 2009, they moved from being shut in to institutions to being shut out from society. And the reason for that was that there was never sufficient funding to enable them to be properly included in community. The second very significant change that occurred as a result of disability rights was a splintering of the disability sector between people with disability who for the first time spoke for themselves, carers, and disability service organisations. Up until that time, there had been unity in the disability sector because it had been the parents of people with children with disability who've been largely responsible for establishing the disability service organisations in our community. But with the disability rights movement, the disability sector splintered. And with that, the power of the disability sector was dissipated. And really, from the mid-1980s onwards, for 30 years, or at least 25 years, very little happened by way of disability policy reform in Australia. But while policy was dormant, there was in fact a very profound demographic change taking place. And this was and remains the case that as the Australian population has aged and as life expectancy has increased, the life expectancy of people with disabilities has increased much more than for the population as a whole. And so for the first time in Australia, people with disability are now more likely to outlive their parents than predecease them. And so the whole informal care system, which has underpinned Australia's disability system, has been brought to the point of collapse. Approximately 80% of care, which for people with disabilities in Australia today, is provided informally, and about 20% is provided by government. So if you have a 1 percentage point reduction in disability, informal disability support from 80% to 79%, you have a similar 1 percentage point increase in the demand for government services. The 1% fall in informal support translates into a 4% increase in demand for government services. So what we've seen is a massive explosion in demand for government services. Often that demand has come at the point of crisis, where families have simply collapsed after years and years of providing informal support. Or parents have become just too old to provide that support, or have died. And so we have been witnessing an explosion in demand for government services. The second aspect that has happened is that, or the second critical aspect, is that with demand for government services far outstripping supply, more and more people with disability found themselves living at or below the poverty line. In fact, in Australia today, 45% of people with disability live at or below the poverty line, the worst performance of any OECD country. So notwithstanding Australia's great wealth, all the wealth that's been derived from our mineral resources, from the explosion in growth in Asia to which we are providing those resources, we have this abject record in terms of people with disability. Carers have also found themselves in a very poor position. So if you look at the well-being of carers in Australia today and you compare that with the general population, carers are twice as likely to be experiencing financial stress as measured by their ability to pay an electricity bill, a gas bill, or a telephone bill, twice as likely to be experiencing physical disability as a result of all the work of caring for a loved one, and twice as likely, and something like 50% of carers have experienced a mental health episode at some time in their lives. And the final point is that with crisis, the disability system in Australia has become increasingly unfair. So today, the support you receive depends on where you live, what your disability is, or how you acquired your disability. So some people have access to no-fault compensation schemes if their injury occurred in the workplace, but if you're born with a disability, you're going to be dependent on family for life. If you live in the inner suburbs, the wealthy suburbs of Sydney or Melbourne, you're much more likely to have access to good disability services than if you live in the outer or poorer suburbs of those cities. And if you're a child with autism, then you get access to an autism package, but if you're a child with spina bifida, you don't. What the National Disability Insurance Scheme does is it changes all of that. It says the support you will receive will depend on your need, rather than when or how or where you live or how you acquired your disability. So the first point about the NDIS is that it is equitable, it's fair. And that has been a really important element in the case that has been made for reform. Because there's something in the Australian psyche which is very deep about fairness and a fair go. The second important difference between the NDIS and the welfare system that we have operated until last Monday is that it is based on insurance. And there are very important differences between a welfare model of supporting people with disability and an insurance model. So let me just touch on a few. The first is that in a welfare model, the pressures are all on reducing spending this year, as it is with most government programs. The pressure is to keep spending down this year, to reduce spending this year. But if you are an insurer, what you seek to minimise is not the cost of support in 1 year, but you seek to minimise the cost over a person's lifetime and maximise opportunity over that lifetime. As a result, in the insurance model, early intervention becomes a very sensible, logical use of resources because of the lifetime payback from that investment. Similarly, home modifications that result in increased independence or delivering a wheelchair on time, which then does not lead to further disabilities because it doesn't fit, are all very sensible and logical ways of organising support for people with disabilities. So there is a much stronger alignment between the interest of the person with disability and the interest of the scheme or the insurer. Similarly, if you're an insurer, you nurture and sustain informal supports rather than burning them out, as the welfare scheme does. The third aspect of insurance is that insurers can change society in ways that individuals cannot. In Australia, insurers have had a profound effect on our community. For example, it was the insurers, the general insurers, that first organised fire brigades in our cities. And in fact, the way it worked was that each insurer had their own fire engines, and they used to, when the fire alarm went off, they used to all go out and check whether it was their building. If it wasn't their building, they'd drive past, you know, and then the insurers realised that they could have cheaper fire brigades by organising a single fire brigade that served all people, the entire community. Similarly, the general insurers, the building insurers, have had a critical effect, a profound effect on the way our buildings are designed. The fire exits are prominently displayed in every room. And and a more recent example is that we have a no-fault motor vehicle accident insurer in some states of Australia, and they have had a profound effect on attitudes to drinking and driving, to the introduction of seatbelts. And Australia was in fact the first country in the world to introduce compulsory seatbelt wearing because of the knowledge that it was going to reduce accidents and so reduce the claims on our third-party motor vehicle insurers. The third critical difference about insurance and the way the NDIS is organised is that it is going to put control and choice in the hands of people with disability. So governments, instead of funding disability service providers to provide services, is going to fund individuals. And that is going to move the power from those service providers to individuals, and it's going to create a marketplace for services, a private sector market for disability services, with all the benefits that that sort of market will provide. And so it will be a market that will encourage innovation, will encourage efficiency, and will over time encourage best practice. The other critical aspect of this reform is it's going to move the cost of disability from one which is growing unsustainably to one that will ultimately be sustainable for governments. Because instead of people with disability gravitating to high costs of support, the investment in them, in their independence, will over time lead to much lower costs of support, and there will also be much greater opportunity for people with disability to get jobs, to be employed, and to themselves pay taxes. So what were the arguments that led to this reform? How did we change the minds of our political leaders? In essence, I think there were 4 or 5 critical arguments that were used to promote this reform. And I think these arguments have a universality that apply to all social policy, apply to health policy, and so I think have great applicability. The first argument, the first critical element of this reform was the language that we used, that we were able to describe the current system as broken. In the absence of being able to describe a system as broken, I think it's impossible to have big reform. You can have small reforms, you can have marginal reforms, but you cannot have transformational reform. The second critical element was that the NDIS is a unifying idea. It unified people with disability, carers, and service providers. But it also created a different sort of unity, because until the NDIS came along, each part of the disability sector was arguing for its own particular reform. So people with cerebral palsy were making the case for more wheelchairs or more accessible buildings, while people with autism were arguing for special therapy services for children with autism. And so there was no unity of claim, there was no unified claim that governments could respond to. But the NDIS, by saying that the basis of support should be need, changed all that and created unity where previously there had been disunity. The third critical element was that when it came to testing this idea, we were able to get endorsement from the leading government economic think tank in Australia, the Productivity Commission. It described the current disability system as unfair, underfunded, inefficient, fragmented, and giving people little choice. And it also argued that the economic benefits of this reform far outweighed the costs. And that credible, independent advice from an arm of government was critical, absolutely essential to getting governments to back this reform. The fourth critical element was that by framing disability policy as an insurance issue, we made disability relevant to every Australian. Because none of us know when we ourselves might acquire a disability, or a child or another family member might acquire a disability. So we were able to say this is for all Australians, not just those with disability. And so, to quote Adam Smith, we were able to draw on the fact that people were both other-regarding, wanting to see a fair go for people with disability, but they were also self-regarding. They could see that this was there for them, for their families, for their future. And so those four arguments together became an overwhelming case for reform. In addition, though, we were able to personalise it. We were able to tell personal stories of what it means to be a person with a disability in Australia today. And on the back of that, we created a movement which we called Every Australian Counts. We always knew that we could not afford a large media campaign in order to gain public support for this reform. And the only way was to enlist the support of people with disability, their families, their carers, and ask them to go out and talk to their friends. And that's what we did. And over a period of a couple of years, more than 150,000 people signed up on the Every Australian Counts website. So it became larger than any other website and any other movement in Australia. And that created the political momentum. So in a sense what we did was we took disability policy from the social and rights issue, which it had always been, to making it an economic issue, to ultimately making it a political issue. And that's what one has to do, in my view, if one wants to get big policy changes in any country. Of course, we could not do this without political leadership from government at the end of the day. And we've been extraordinarily fortunate that this movement took place when the Disability Minister in Australia, Jenny Macklin, who has a deep understanding of social policy, was the relevant minister. And she was greatly interested in this reform. We're also very fortunate that initially the Parliamentary Secretary for Disability Policy, Disability in Australia, was a man called Bill Shorten, and Bill is a great orator and a great advocate and a great motivator of people. And between Bill and Jenny, we've had extraordinary political leadership, and ultimately leadership from the Prime Minister, or the then Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. And all of this culminated in Australians saying they were willing to fund this reform. And 2 months ago, the decision was taken by the government to increase the universal health insurance premium in this country, the Medicare levy, by 0.5% to part fund the NDIS. And overwhelmingly, it's been supported by the Australian people. It must be the fastest and most popular tax increase in the history of Australia, and I suspect the history of many countries. When people were polled immediately afterwards, 80% of Australians said they supported the increase in the levy, 10% that said they opposed it, and 10% were undecided. An overwhelming endorsement. So, in conclusion, my message to you as you contemplate the role of the private sector in health policy and health reform is don't be daunted by the task. I would argue that in our case, the size of the task actually helped us. We could not have brought about a reform of this scale if the current disability system were not deeply and irreversibly broken. I also would suggest that you draw inspiration from others. In my case, I have been inspired by the work of the abolitionists, those people who had a single idea, and that idea was freedom. When they embarked on their crusade, they had no power, they had no money, they just had an idea, and the idea was freedom. So if your cause is just, if your cause is fair and equitable, if you can create a unifying idea, an idea that brings people together, if you can have that idea endorsed independently and credibly, and if you've got determination and resolve and commitment, you can change the world for the better. Thank you very much.